Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're dialing from, and welcome to Asia Society Australia and to our executive briefing on semiconductors and competition and conflict around them. My name is Philip Ivanov. I'm the CEO of Asia Society in Australia. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples, the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people that join in our webcast today. Semiconductors power our digital economy. They're also a foreign policy and geopolitical competition instrument. And in today's event, we'll discuss the fundamental role that semiconductors play in modern technology and explain how business and government prepare for an era of strategic competition in which semiconductors are already in short supply. Before we get into today's discussion, let me go through the usual housekeeping. We'll have a 30-minute panel discussion, and then we'll move to a Q&A. So please have your questions ready. We want to make it as interactive as possible in this new virtual world. And please submit your questions through a Q&A box at any time, and our moderator will monitor those questions and will ask you to pose them directly to our speakers. And please keep yourself on mute and your video on. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Joining us from San Francisco, Anja Manuel is the co-founder and principal of Rice, Hadley, Gates and Manuel LLC, a strategic consulting firm that helps US companies navigate international markets. She previously served as an official at the US Department of State, responsible for South Asia policy, and is a frequent commentator on foreign policy and technology policy. Chun Lee, currently the Deputy Executive Director of the Taiwan WTO and RTA Center, Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research. Dr. Lee was a member of the Advisory Committee of Taiwan Mainland Affairs Council from 2018 to 2020. He specializes in trade liberalization policy, WTO services trade, non-tariff measures, and regional integration. And we also have the pleasure of hosting Merriden Varrall, Director of the Australia Geopolitics Hub at KPMG, is a good friend of Asia Society. Merriden will set the scene for today's discussion and moderate our panel. A former UN diplomat based in China, Merriden is a sought-after expert and commentator on geopolitics, East Asia, China's foreign policy, and Australia's bilateral relationship with China. So for a full view of the expertise of our speakers, please be sure to click on the link we're sharing with you now to read their full biographies. So welcome everyone, special acknowledgement and thank you to our members. And thank you for participating in this panel, and great to have you with us. Really looking forward to the discussion. Over to you, Merriden.
Thank you very much, Philip, and hello everyone. It's lovely to virtually see everyone here on the screen. We are really in for a great conversation today. This is an unbelievably pertinent and timely topic, and we have some fantastic expertise here on the panel. As you would have already known, a quick search on the internet shows us that not so long ago, information about semiconductors was pretty dry, pretty factual. It was about what they were and how they worked. But suddenly, following a global shortage of semiconductors, last year there was this dramatic spike in the number of articles about semiconductors, and the tone of these articles changed significantly. Now everyone was talking about where they were made, who was making them, who was buying them, supply chain resilience, and increasingly, semiconductors as an aspect of national security. In June this year, the US Senate passed a bill with broad bipartisan support to invest around the equivalent of Australian dollars 330 billion into innovation and competition, with a big part of that on the domestic production of semiconductors. Now, Is this enormous amount of money, roughly 7.5 times Australia's entire annual defence budget, just because President Biden loves semiconductors? No, of course it's not. It's a symptom of the increasingly competitive and mistrustful global environment we find ourselves in, the shift in the international system away from cooperation and towards securitization. And the US is explicit that investment into semiconductors is absolutely key to, quote, the competition to win the 21st century. And the US is by no means the only actor on the world stage who understands semiconductors to be a central aspect of this zero-sum competition. So the geopoliticization of semiconductors is something we all need to watch, because semiconductors are pretty close to being critical to the continuation and progress of life as we know it. They're central to the Industrial Revolution 4.0, to our tech and digital future, and they're essential for tackling the climate crisis. So in addition to all the usual challenges of supply and demand, if state security is increasingly being understood to depend on access to semiconductors, the industry is in for some big changes. I want to go back to basics before we get really deep into this conversation. And I want to ask Anja, please, for those of us who are not entirely 100% certain, what is a semiconductor? Why are they so fundamental to modern technology?
Absolutely. Thank you, Merriden, and thank you all for having me. I'm so happy to speak to the Asia Society Australia. I wish it could be in person, but happy to be with you remotely from San Francisco. So I'll give an entirely non-technical answer. Philip told us before that his father is actually a physicist working on semiconductors. I am not. I'm a policy person and a business person. And I think for those in the audience, what you need to understand is that semiconductors are the fundamental building blocks of the information age. They are the brains that run everything from your smartphone, your computer, your smart thermostat, your self-driving car, or even your non-self-driving car, and those fancy new submarines that Australia is about to acquire. So they're really important. And at their basics, they're silicon wafers that have a conductive property somewhere between a conductor and an insulator. So you can really modify the electric current, and then they get stacked together into something called an integrated circuit. But the bottom line, what you all need to know is it's the brains that run everything in the information age. I don't know, Roy, if you want to add to that.
Of course, but in Taiwan, we were joking that semiconductor is sort of COVID-19 vaccine now. It's essential, not from low-tech stuff all the way to the latest iPhone 13, right? And the supply has been kind of unstable for the last 24 months. And TSMC, the largest pure play foundry company in the world, just announced yesterday that they expect the shortage will continue all the way to sustain all the way into late 2022, right? So I think the key is really about the function of semiconductor. The demand is still on the rise. Let's take electric vehicle as an example. Traditional vehicle require at least 50 different types of semiconductor chips already. But for an EV, one low floor estimation is that they require at least 150 different semiconductors chips installed in a car. So it's virtually like a computer now. So you can see the demand is still on the rise, and there's a distortion of the pandemic, and that's probably why things are making semiconductors so critical now. It's not only about the function of the semiconductor, but also the demand and the distortions that are still ongoing.
So, Roy, would you say that they're the main crunch points in this global shortage? Is the COVID impacts on supply at the moment?
I think it's the COVID. Well, I think two things. One is the surge of demand for semiconductors, primarily because people working from home and driving their own car and other things. So there's a sudden surge of demand for semiconductor. But on the other hand, I think the blame goes also to the way those operators manage their supply chain. For example, many of the car auto chips company are running the supply chain based on what we call Toyota management system. That is, you minimize the stockpile of everything, including chips, and you put the pressure on your suppliers. So suddenly last year, all these companies realized that there's a surge of demand from the auto industry on their semiconductor chip. Then they go to their suppliers, and the supplier answers to them that, well, look, our capacity is full now. You have to book like 6 months ahead. We cannot just convert the supply chain for you. So their stockpile is running dry. And that's the starting point of all this distortion of shortage.
Right.
So the main crunch point is the way they manage the supply chain, but also because the concentration of fabrication, that's the manufacturing of semiconductor. Only 2 companies, Samsung and TSMC, is able to produce the latest technology, 5 nanometer semiconductors. So there's no way for them to increase their capacity overnight.
And given this situation in which we've got increasing demand and constraints on supply at the moment, I imagine that some of the major manufacturers are trying to build up their supply and build up their industry. So Anja, what's China doing in this space to build up its industry?
Yeah, a huge amount. And this is where we go quickly from a technical topic to a geopolitical topic. So having said that semiconductors are the thing that makes everything in the information age run, this is really the oil of the 21st century. So it's important who can produce it at the cutting edge. And I wish I had a world map, but in a very broad brushstroke, which will be a little inaccurate, but roughly right. Many of the most advanced chips are designed in the United States, sometimes also in Asia, but often in the United States. The fabs, the factories, are often in Asia, especially in Taiwan, where Roy is beaming in from, but also in Japan and South Korea. Those are then often transported to China, where they get assembled into the iPhones and computers and everything that's in everyone's pockets right now, and then re-exported all around the world. So this is a globally integrated supply chain. China alone consumes more than $300 billion annually, 60% of the world's total demand in semiconductors. But they don't produce much of them. It was 7%, now it's about 12%, so they produce now only about 12% of global semiconductors, and often still at the lower end of the sophistication scale. So they're worried about this. They don't want to be reliant on the rest of the world because they know it's a weak point. So under a plan called Made in China 2025, China's goal was to reach 40% self-reliance in semiconductor manufacturing by last year, and 70% by 2025. It hasn't done that. It's only reached about 15%. And they've pumped a huge amount of money in there. The estimates vary, but at least $150 billion in subsidies have gone to Chinese, building up Chinese local semiconductor manufacturing. Now, one of the largest recipients of that largesse was Chung-Hua Group, and it's just gone into bankruptcy. So the jury's out a little bit on whether they will succeed. They're also, and I think Roy will speak to this, doing a lot to hire away, to both buy talent, hire away talent, and get the most advanced technologies from the West, which I can expand on in a little bit.
Sure. So quickly, just following in on that, you were talking about they've only hit 15% of a much larger goal. Is that because of lack of talent? Is that the core of the issue, and that's why they're going into this hiring and buying strategy?
No, the issue is everything. This is hard. It's incredibly sophisticated. It's a very cutthroat industry. It's very capital intensive. So you need the talent, which these days it's spread all over the world, but a lot of it is in Taiwan, Japan, Korea, the US, and in some cases in Europe. You need the manufacturing equipment, so the machines that are in the fabs that actually make the semiconductors. And most of that equipment, those machines, are produced in the US, in the Netherlands, and in Japan. And the West has woken up to this and is worried about it, just like you said in your introduction, Merriden, and they're export controlling a lot of it.
All right, so we see that China's a bit behind its goals, but obviously the US is still worried that China is going to be making progress and is going to be getting ahead all the same. So we're sort of working on the assumption that the failure so far to reach those goals is only a temporary glitch. Is that a fair understanding?
Yeah, it is fair. And I would sometimes say, being mildly self-critical of my own government, at first, no one was thinking about semiconductors. Then everyone panicked. And now, you know, many members of Congress are talking about it without actually knowing much about the industry. And so in certain areas, I worry that we're overreacting. Do you want me to say a word now about what the US is doing?
Yeah, that's perfect. Let's talk about how the Biden administration is responding to this.
Yeah. So the wake-up call really came during the Trump administration, and you do have to give them credit for sounding the alarm. I would say the first steps that were taken were largely defensive. So it's stop the Chinese from buying our most advanced technology, stop Chinese scientists from learning the most advanced methods in the United States, stop the espionage, stop Chinese from investing in our most advanced technology. So it's export controls, it's CFIUS, which is our investment restrictions, and they are tough. They went from, you know, you could almost export everything to now some of the semiconductor companies in the US tell me they can't even export what they consider 1990s era technology to China, especially if it's Huawei and SMIC, which are kind of the two big companies in China that need this stuff. And in our industry's view, it's actually hampering the US and the West from staying ahead in this race because they use selling the slightly older technology to China and elsewhere to fund the very expensive research and development budget to keep it on the cutting edge. And of course, the export controls so far also aren't international. So if the US restricts everything, then if I were China, they just go and buy it from Japan or the Netherlands or elsewhere, for example. And that's what you see happening. Now, on the positive, what I would call the positive offensive side, you're starting to see some real steps. And you mentioned it, Merriden, but I would say the most important part is that the US is starting to reshape our government because we're not set up for a technology competition. We don't have a tech minister. You know, Gina Raimondo, who is our Secretary of Commerce, has now really taken on that mantle, and she's getting some expertise in semiconductors elsewhere in there, but we're not set up for this race. And so we're trying to move the boxes around in our bureaucracy to make it happen better. You mentioned the Innovation Competition Act. An initial version passed. It's not finally done. That's part of what they're haggling over in the US Congress right now, endlessly. But this piece of it, subsidies for semiconductors, is really bipartisan, and everyone anticipates that it'll go through. And you had the number in Australian dollars. I'm sorry, I don't. But in US dollars, it's 52 billion, which is a huge chunk of change. About 40 billion of that is to build some fabs, which are these big factories in the United States. That's great. The worry there is, which fabs are you going to build? Are they going to be cutting edge? And these things are expensive. I mean, Roy can say more, but that will buy you 5, 6, 7 fabs maybe. And if they're outdated soon, it doesn't do very much. It's probably 40 billion is probably about 5 months capital spend of this industry. And then 10 billion more is going to research and development. I'll just stop there.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Anja. And Roy, I'd like to turn to you now to talk a little bit about the Taiwan industry and how, you know, we're talking about these challenges in the US. How has Taiwan gone around about developing its semiconductor industry so well? What kind of policies has the government adopted there?
Let me start by picking up what Anja was just talking about, the U.S. policy towards semiconductors. TSMC is right now building a mega factory facility in the state of Arizona. And the TSMC is seeking to have a non-discriminatory treatment on receiving those funding from the CHIPS Act, right? Because according to their estimation, the cost of production in the US is at least somewhere between 40 to 70% more than producing the similar chips here in Taiwan. Now, let me define first. There were different levels of chips technologies. For example, China right now is only able to achieve what we call 14 nanometer level. That's something that TSMC were already producing 7 years ago. So it's about 3 to 4 generations behind. What TSMC and Samsung are producing now is 5 nanometer. Well, nanometer is not really about the size. It's about the number of transistors in a defined area, but also the speed of functioning and the consumption of electricity. So it's much lower than 7, 3, and 5 will be much lower than 14. So for iPhone 13, you need at least 5 nanometer chips. So let's put it this way. Now, TSMC is manufacturing this facility in Arizona, targeting 5 nanometer, but everybody's guessing that it will be soon be producing 3 nanometer from the year 2024 onwards, right? Okay, now, so, and also, 49% of Taiwan's trade export to China are semiconductors. That's the single largest source of our trade surplus with China, right? So for China, there is a security concern because their demand of chips are so concentrated in Taiwan and South Korea that they consider is a source of national security threat. And that is the reason why they have put in all the resources on a national level to create a supply chain of semiconductor, a domestic supply chain, which still they are still like 3-5 generations behind. So we'll see how it goes. Now come back to Taiwan. I think the key is talents and R&D. Since the year 2018, Taiwan spent more expenditure on research and development than Japan on a per capita basis. Now we are top 3 spenders on R&D country in the world, just behind Israel and South Korea. And that is really the key for the success story of not only semiconductors, but all other high-tech sectors. The second is this cooperation between research labs with the companies. Morris Chang, who is the founder of TSMC, used to be the president, before he went to TSMC, was the president of the Institute of Industrial Research in Taiwan, which is a government-supported research institute on high-tech technologies. So he ran that research labs, national research labs, for 5 years before he moved to TSMC. Still very close. Well, they were right next to each other still, right, in Hsinchu. You have TSMC here, and then you have the research lab here. And there were 2 universities just behind these factories supporting all these talents training. And still number 1, the top 3 departments in uni in Taiwan are medical schools, electric engineering, and information engineering. So all these talented young people here are still, when going into those areas. So I think that would be 3 sources of the factors that make Taiwan so successful.
Yeah, so they really need to be thinking ahead and investing hard. That's really sounds like that's the bottom line. Now we've got a couple of more issues that we want to get through. We don't have heaps of time before we turn to the audience for questions. And on that, I'd just like to do a call out to our participants to send some questions in the chat. Happy to take them as we go along as well. And so thank you for that one that's come through. I've just asked for a bit more of a clarification on that one. But what I'd like to turn to now is a bit more of this kind of geopolitical challenge. Anja, as technological decoupling between China and the US begins to accelerate, where is the private sector in regards to state interests in the US? Are they fairly aligned? And do you see more of a cohesion between state and private interests in China as well?
Yeah, It's such a good question. It's really important. I would say 2 years ago, it wasn't at all aligned. And now we're gradually moving in the right direction. So it is still the case that US businesses are much more positive about doing business with and in China than the US government, which sees it now largely as a national security concern and is basically worried about it and would like more decoupling. And by the way, that is bipartisan. We always joke at the firm that, you know, it's Republicans and Democrats are notoriously at each other's throats here in Washington. The one thing that has managed to unite them is Xi Jinping. And the one freebie in politics in the US these days is to be very anti-China. Often that's a little bit worrisome. And I think business is coming along, but here's where I would say the disconnect is. So the semiconductor industry, understandably very excited about CHIPS Act funding. The lobbying for who gets what has already begun. And Roy, you mentioned it with TSMC wanting to also be included because they're like the cutting edge manufacturer in the world. And why wouldn't they get some of the money? And so there's a lot of worry. And when I talk to my friends in the Biden administration who are in charge of putting this all together, of how do we make sure that this money, which is an enormous amount, but as I said, is only a few months of capital spend and could easily be wasted, how do we give it the biggest bang for the buck? How do you get private sector money to come in behind it to leverage that public sector money? One. So in that sense, they're aligned. The research and development piece, and Roy, you had such an important point, which is that Taiwan has really doubled down on that. When you look at economic studies, each dollar a government invests in R&D has $5 of benefit to society. Now, it doesn't always go to the people you want, doesn't necessarily only go to people in your country, but it's a good investment of your taxpayer money. So it's good that about 10 billion is going to that. It is totally unclear so far how that's going to be spent, who's going to get it. Is it universities? Is it national research labs? Is it some private sector labs? But so to that extent, industry and government are aligned. On the restrictive piece that I talked about before, the industry is understandably worried because they think there's overreach by the government and they're actually going to make our industry less competitive by being so closed.
That's fascinating. It's really fascinating what you're talking about there as well, with the shift of businesses and becoming more aligned with the the political point of view about concerns with China. And I think that's something we're seeing in Australia. We're a bit further behind on that, but perhaps that's something that we have in common there.
Yeah. Merriden, let me just give you one kind of personal anecdote on that. Yeah. 2 years ago, I gave a local TED talk here on China and technology and what we should be thinking about. And afterwards, I was inundated with calls and emails from friends in the tech sector saying, oh my God, you're so hardline and you're so crazy anti-China. And inundated with emails and calls from friends in the government saying, oh my God, you're so dovish and soft on China. So yeah. They're still pretty far apart.
Yeah, right. Fascinating. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I wanted to think a little bit about the geopolitics and how that's playing out in Taiwan, Roy, and how Taiwan is ensuring that its supply chains are, as much as possible, being insulated from these geopolitical pressures, particularly in the US-China strategic competition. Are these tensions having a tangible effect on Taiwan's semiconductor industry?
Well, of course there will be, because the semiconductor industry here in Taiwan is collaborating with the US on those export control measures, primarily because many of the manufacturers here adopt some level of US technologies, especially patented technologies. So by regulation, they have to work with the US export control regime, right? But so they lost some of their clients in China, but they were in a very brief time period replaced by new orders and demands from elsewhere. So commercially, they are not suffering, right? And also we are actually, as a country, we are actually seeing some positive development because we are seeing a huge number of Taiwanese manufacturers returning from China back to Taiwan because they were the subject of trade war between the US and China, and they were concerned about this expanded scope of the export control and technologies and other factors. So they moved back to Taiwan. So last year they were about, now I think we are reaching about $8 billion US of new investments of returning home Taiwanese companies. So the interesting part is that, for example, all the iPhones are manufactured. I mean, iPhones use chips manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan, but designed by the US company Apple Computer, but assembled in China by Foxconn, which again is a Taiwanese company in China, and export to the US. So it is a global supply chain that is subject to the geopolitical tension. Absolutely right. So yeah. Foxconn, for example, a Taiwanese company, is relocating some of the manufacturing capacity back to Taiwan, but also to India and elsewhere, Brazil, diversifying the risks. But for those who cannot diversify, then they come back to Taiwan. So I think that's something that we were able to capture the benefits. But also many of them moved to Vietnam and other ASEAN countries, increasingly probably Mexico and the US. So yes, on the downside, I think they suppliers facing a lot of uncertainties about relocation, right? They are moving into new territories, working with new suppliers. There will be uncertainties. But in general, I think we will be able to respond and isolate, as you use the description, from the geopolitical tension.
That's great, thank you. And it's really interesting to sort of think about how that's diversification is spreading around the world. I want to bring it back to Australia a little bit. We are getting some questions coming into the chat. This is fantastic, and I'd like to have time to turn to those. But very quickly before we do, just turning to Australia a bit, this is a question for either or both of you. As we see this fight for dominance in the technological sphere between the global powers, any ideas or suggestions for what middle powers like Australia can do to ensure that they're not cut off from supply chains? Anja, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think a lot, well, first of all, I think it's going to be in the interest of the big tech powers to keep middle powers in the loop. So already in the US, you have a lot of conversations around a Technology 10, Techno-Democracies Alliance. Now, no one has quite defined what that is. I would argue that it should mean that countries that are democracies, what we would traditionally call the West, but I would include Taiwan, Australia, Japan, others in that, should collaborate on certain important technical things. Now, semiconductors is a big piece of that, and that's what we're talking today. But for example, rational standards around artificial intelligence development. Australia can be enormously helpful there, right? What happens with technical standards on 5G and 6G, all of these things that used to be in the background and not make the front pages of the newspaper, I think, Merriden, as you said in the beginning, now they're geostrategic issues. And Australia, the UK, I was just with some diplomats from the UK, European countries, everyone plays an enormously important role, especially if we all pull together.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Roy, what do you think about this one?
Okay, just two additional footnotes to that. First is resilience. Look what happened to lobster from Tasmania last year. And the concentration of exports to China subject Australia to coercive actions by countries like China. So diversification probably is one important keyword for Australia to maintain a key player in the global supply chain. Also, it happened to the coal and other raw materials exported to China. So diversification, keeping multiple sources of import and export is very important. That's something that Taiwan is also trying to achieve in the next couple of years. And also keeping leadership in technologies. I know Australia is leading some of the research on hydrogen energy and other technologies on carbon emission reduction area. I think that's a good way to go. because that's something that will be able to keep Australia in not only in the loop, but also in the leadership seat.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are all very practical and useful suggestions. And when we're thinking still about Australia, you know, Australia has quite a reasonable deposit of some of the important rare earth elements and critical minerals that are needed in this industry as well. Do you have any thoughts on how that might change the global geopolitics of semiconductors or Australia's position in the world from a geopolitical point of view? Anja, can I start with you again?
I think I'm not the right person to answer that, but Roy, do you want to take it?
Yeah. Well, I think my recommendation for Australia is be careful, because they will from time to time we see technology leapfrogging, right? So rare earth become not so rare, maybe in 10 years time, because it's so rare now that people are putting resources to find substitutions, just to increase the level of security. I think that's the kind of risks that I think Australia has to assess. Rare earth, well, China is also producing rare earth. Japan is cultivating somewhere else. So that's one way. Already countries are trying to increase the supply of rare earth. Let's take rare earth as the example. It's not exclusive. But also, I understand there are technologies development that are trying to find substitutions that without rare earth, they are still able to produce semiconductors, at least reduce the reliance on rare earth. Right. So technology advancements that happened from time to time in history that will make something that is so critical at this moment become, you know, so irrelevant in 10 years time. So I think that's something that Australia has to really pay high attention to, that development and trying to move on with adapt to those development direction.
Very good point.
Can I add one point, because Roy brought up the reliance on the China market of Australia and so many other Asian economies. And we feel that in the US a little bit, but not as strongly. When I talk to friends in Korea, they say, yeah, okay, we'd be happy to ally with you, but you know, we're the ones who are going to get punished, right? Just like Australia just felt. And I do think there's been a positive movement in the last few years where at least countries share information, where it wouldn't normally make the news. Now, you know, what's happened with little Lithuania over Taiwan recently is worldwide news in a way that no one would know before. And I think that's a precursor to actually possibly, this is still in the realm of theory, helping each other when something like this happens. So it doesn't all have to be anti-China. We all want to trade with China. We want to cooperate. We want China to rise and remain stable. But to the extent that they're being an irresponsible or very aggressive international power, can we help each other? So if Australia is being punished by Chinese boycotts, can other countries say, okay, well, we'll lift all those duties on Australian goods so that they can find other markets, for example. Now, that's easier said from the West Coast than done in Washington, but hopefully in a few years, we'll get closer to that.
Yeah, right. So increasing global cooperation. That's an interesting
On trade specifically.
Yeah, on trade particularly. Yeah. So let's turn to some questions from the audience now. We've got, I've seen this anonymous question, and I think Roy answered that in his earlier response. So let's move to this question from Mark Eels. Thank you, Mark. In talking about success from Industry Research Institute collaboration, how do you see the Yangtze River Delta high-tech IC zone alliance configuration? Do you think this is likely to succeed? What do you see as being the institutional barriers? Is this one for you, do you think, Anja, or Roy? Who would like to take that one?
Maybe I'll start first,
Sure.
if you don't mind. Well, first of all, China is putting a lot of resources, government or party-sponsored resources into semiconductor industry. But the source of the problem is because of this structure. There were a lot of so many distortions and so many wasteful investments just to get locked in with the receiving the resources from the state, that we are seeing bankrupt, empty fabrication facilities and other, you know, all the cities and provinces in China are pursuing the same objective of achieving domestic semiconductor sector. Many of them are genuine, but a lot of them are not. They're just fake factories trying to receive the funding only, right? A lot of distortions, and also the distortion actually, and the competition between different parts of China is actually distorting the supply of talents and resources and the people. We know that there were key persons from Taiwan who working for SMIC are now retiring and returning back to Taiwan because they are tired of the ecosystems in China. So I think that's the main, if I put it, institutional barriers in China. Is state-come sponsored. The development is not linked directly with commercial market, and there were a lot of distortions in the system, in the ecosystem, from all the way from Beijing down to the city side. So I think that's probably why they spent 20 years and so much resources, but still able to achieve only 15% domestic supply.
I agree with all that wholeheartedly. I would just add the following. In the US, when you have a rear view mirror in your car, it sometimes says, these objects may be closer than they appear. So while China has wasted a huge amount of money, fabs that don't really exist, everybody's looking for the handouts, not as much talent mobility as you have in a place like Taiwan or Australia or the US, they are making important progress. And so I think
yes,
we shouldn't be too nervous about it, but we also shouldn't take our eye off the ball.
Yes,
absolutely.
Excellent. I think that's an excellent way to characterize it, Anja. Thank you. There's a question here from Glenn Downey. Are there obvious areas where the US and Australia can be aligned and generate economic activity on semiconductor materials and semiconductor design, e.g. rare and critical earth minerals, materials science, 5G, 6G, wave, quantum? We've only got a couple of minutes left, so if I could ask you guys to answer succinctly, please, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think we talked about the rare earths and design. I think there's an important additional point that we haven't talked about, which is more collaboration between our universities. So far, that's been largely ad hoc. If Stanford professor has a friend in Australia, then you collaborate or not. I think some of that is about to become a little bit more directed. Like, I know there's a lot of work between the US and the EU on the Trade and Technology Council to do more specific research. In the 90s, it went all the way to having a research map for semiconductors. I don't think that works now, but you could imagine something that's a little more guided than it is today.
Thanks, Anja. And any last thoughts on that from you, please, Roy?
Well, I think Australia is leading in the research of, for example, quantum computing, right? And quantum computing has been identified by the US as well as emerging technologies, right? So I'm just using this example. I think we need to just US and Australia maybe wants to review their priority areas and to kind of collaborating their priorities and resources, including, for example, research, R&D activities at university and other tech labs.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Roy. And I mean, I think this is such a fascinating topic, and we could talk about it for hours, if not days, but I'd like to thank you both very much for those fascinating insights. And I'd like to hand back to Philip, please.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Merriden and Anja and Roy, for such a rich and insightful discussion. Of course, we only touched the surface of this very complex topic on the intersection of technology, economic and geopolitical competition and Asia society globally, including our center, but also our colleagues in San Francisco, particularly, who I know are on the call today. We'll continue to explore this topic of technology, foreign policy, and economic competition. This event is also important for selfish reasons. As Anja said, my father is a professor of physics, the part of physics that's important for semiconductors. And since I decided to study Chinese history, I think I've been a great source of disappointment for him. So I think I redeemed myself today with this event on semiconductors, and I'm sending him the recording of this event straight after the event because he hasn't joined it. So, but on a more serious note, thank you to our members for your continued support and for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Join us next week for our public event under our China Executive Briefing Project, where we talk about the cooperation with China on climate change, coinciding, of course, with the next policy paper on China's climate change policies that is presented with our friends at China Policy. This will be a part of our program of events and publications coinciding with Glasgow COP26 conference. And so join us to discuss the potential for climate change cooperation between China and the rest of the world. And please register through the link that we are sharing with you right now. Again, thank you all for joining us, to our members and to the audiences. And thanks so much again to our speakers for sharing your insights with us. Have a great day.